So let's review the problem, which is the temperature is rising. So before I read this slide, I also want to let you know that I have included a Word copy of the problem. So you can also go to that Word copy to read this information. But I'm going to go, in these slides, I'm going to take you through a little bit about the process and how you want to think about this. So in your role as a school food service director, you have been attending a number of different conferences. At the last conference you went to, you participated in a session about continuous quality improvement. When you returned to your school district, you decided to use the CQI process to investigate the current issues with reduced participation in the high school. And your participation is just 38%. A survey was sent to the high school students regarding meal quality. There were several issues identified, and you have decided to focus on one that was mentioned by more than 65% of the survey participants. The issue is related to the milk offered at lunch. Students have indicated that the milk tastes gross and is warm. You analyzed the sales records, food production records, and recent invoices for milk and realized that sales, the number of students who have taken milk as part of a reimbursable meal and have purchased, has decreased significantly in the last month, from 57% of students to 19% of students. In addition, you notice that while sales numbers have decreased, your order for milk have remained the same. It's time to get to work and solve the problem. So the approach that you're going to use to review this problem is the CQI process. So the first step in the CQI process is to analyze the situation. You have these survey results and think about what's the problem. The problem is that there's low participation and you have some issues with the milk. And so you want to see if there is some connection. So that's the information that you need to kind of uncover. So the first step in the CQI process is really to define the areas for improvement, or really analyze the information that you might have from the survey results. So you conducted the student meal survey, you analyzed the results, and milk is the problem. Step one is done. A couple other things to think about in terms of this problem overall are service considerations. So, from a food safety perspective, you know, the milk we know should be served at 41 degrees Fahrenheit or lower and be stored at that. But is there any research or any information out there that tells us that milk maybe should be served at a colder temperature? Do people like it served at a colder temperature? So maybe do a little investigative work to find out about that. You may also want to think about packaging considerations. And I've talked about this a couple times, plastic versus cardboard. Do colorful graphics make a difference? Um, Offering different flavor options, strawberry, banana, coffee, all of these different flavors. Will that potentially help increase milk acceptability? Maybe different size options. Would you consider doing a promotional idea? The milk mustache is really old, but is there a more up-to-date milk promotion that you could tie in to help encourage students to, you know, drink more milk? Step 2 is to identify possible causes. And this is where you're going to put together a fishbone diagram. You're going to use that cause and effect diagram to think about what are all the potential theoretical issues or causes that you might have for the warm milk and ultimately the low participation. So your fishbone diagram should have the scales that include materials, methods, training or environment, and staff. So here's an example of a fishbone diagram. So you're going to want to create a fishbone diagram for this problem. And you're going to identify what are some potential causes within a school nutrition environment for warm milk. And so you're going to need to think about this, what those potential areas or potential causes could be. This is where you're going to need to put your creative thinking cap on to come up with potential causes. Step 3 is develop an action plan. This is your who, what, when, how you're going to impact and not have more milk anymore. So you're going to change the problem. You're going to fix the problem. So in terms of our situation here, we want to think about who is responsible for the milk temperatures. What should be done to keep the milk cold? When should this be done? How should it be done? We might also think about packaging considerations, which keep the milk cold. Is it, good to be in a paper or is it better to be in a plastic? You want to think about some of these things. As part of this action plan that you put together, you could think about temperature logs. You could think about a checklist. And in fact, on the next slide, I'm going to show you an example of a checklist. So this is an example of a checklist that could be included in the action plan. So this checklist analyzes milk temperatures, and we have it's set up here for each lunch period. So this school potentially has 3 or 4 lunch periods, 3 lunch periods. And so the milk temperature is taken at the beginning of each lunch period, and then it's taken at the end of the last lunch period. So, you might include some information about this in your action plan to show that you're thinking about ways that you can actually monitor the temperature of the milk. This is another checklist that you might think about including. This one looks at the cooler temperature. So the first was the temperature of the milk, but this is actually looking to analyze the temperature of, or keep track of the temperature in cooler 1 and cooler 2. So we've talked so far about 3 of the steps in the CQI process. The 4th and 5th step, well, the 4th step is actually implementing the action plan, right? And then the 5th step is evaluating the outcomes. The 6th step, not listed here, would be to standardize the process and start all over again. But, what should happen next within this problem? How would you implement the action plan that you put together to impact the milk, so that it's not warm? And that, in your attempt to ultimately increase participation, what would you do? And how would you evaluate the outcomes? How would you know if you were successful? So think about that in terms of the problem. So as you're analyzing this problem, keep in mind the participation rates. So can improving the quality of milk or the milk offerings increase participation? And think about what other recommendations you have for this problem. So what are you going to need to do for this problem? So you're going to analyze the problem using the CQI process and determine the next steps that must be taken to solve the problem. And so the problem that we have identified are reduced sales of milk and decreased participation in the lunch program. So in writing up this information, your write-up should include an overview of the CQI process and how it will be used to analyze this problem. So how are you going to use each of the steps in the CQI process to analyze this process or analyze this problem? You must include a fishbone diagram, so that cause and effects model, that outlines each of the elements of the problem. And then you have to discuss each of the elements that you've outlined in the fishbone. You want to describe how working to solve this problem may increase the overall participation rates in the school lunch program here. So that's really what you're doing. So your write-up needs to include the overview, the fishbone diagram, a discussion of the elements of the fishbone diagram, and then describe how working to solve the problem increases overall participation, theoretically. So each of the items that are outlined here need to be listed. So you should list at the top of the page an overview of CQI process and how it will be used to analyze a problem, and then your response should be underneath it, right? So put the question and then your answer to that should be right underneath it for each one of those 4 items. Your responses can be based on text, lecture or information that was presented in the slides, and outside research. So I'm expecting that you're going to do a little research and that information is going to be included in your answers. Information should be in your own words. You do not need to use quotes, and you shouldn't use quotes. So I don't expect to see like large quoted pieces of information within your response. That doesn't count. Your information should include a reference. So if the information, the information that you're putting together should include references. And you can, because this is an individual assignment, you can include one bibliography, one reference list at the end of all of these questions. Again, this information is in a Word document that is posted online in Blackboard so that you have that to go through as well. And of course, you can always reach out to me if you have any questions about this information.